So we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and his presidency a little bit, and we're going to begin with Republicans taking power, in which Jefferson was a Republican. Key terms for this section include laissez-faire, Marbury versus Madison, and judicial review. Now, the election of 1800 was very different from what we consider today. People did not travel around and campaign if you were a candidate. Instead, you would write letters, hundreds of letters, to leading citizens and friendly newspapers throughout the country to get them to publicize your point of view. Now, Republicans, which again was Jefferson's party, had warned that the Federalists would bring back the monarchy. They were very concerned about the growing size of the government. The Federalists, on the other hand, said that Thomas Jefferson was godless. And we need to remember, in this time period, this time in the country, religion was essential, very, very important. So to be considered godless was a huge mark against Thomas Jefferson. Well, when the members of the Electoral College voted, Thomas Jefferson and the Federalist candidate Aaron Burr were deadlocked. Now, at this time, electors voted for each presidential and vice presidential candidate separately rather than voting for a party's candidate as a team. So when it was tied, that meant that the House of Representatives had to decide the election. Well, in the House, the Federalists saw a chance to ensure that a Republican would not take power. They needed to support Burr. But the election was still tied in the House. And then we have a little bit of wheeling and dealing. Alexander Hamilton, even though he was a Federalist and him and Jefferson did not agree on much, Hamilton did not trust Burr. So he was able to use his power to convince one Federalist to not vote for Burr. And instead, that one vote, that one person that he convinced, meant that Jefferson became the president and Burr would be the vice president. So we have Thomas Jefferson there. They passed the 12th Amendment in 1803. I don't have a picture of Aaron Burr. And this basically prevents this ever from happening again. A Federalist and a Republican, or a Democrat and a Republican, or two separate political parties from being elected together. Thomas Jefferson changed things almost immediately. On March 4th, 1801, he was dressed in his plain, everyday clothes to give his inauguration, that speech right after you become president. And he said he wanted to bridge the gap between political parties and he wanted to be seen as an everyday citizen. He considered himself the first citizen. So he wasn't separated from the people, and that's why he wore his everyday clothes. He outlined his goals that he had for the country. They are very Republican goals. Strong states, he believed, would be the best to protect the freedom of the people. He also believed in a term called laissez-faire. This is a key term. And the definition is the government plays only a small part in the economics of the country. Literally, it's a French term that means hands off. The government needs to mind its own business. It needs to stay away from the economy, and Americans will prosper if the government stays out of it. Jefferson was very concerned with the national debt. Remember, we start this country in debt. We had to borrow money to fight a revolution. So his treasurer, Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, and President Jefferson put together a plan to reduce the national debt. They did it by first cutting the military. The army was cut by a third, And they also reduced the Navy from 25 ships down to 7 ships. A huge reduction in the military. They also repealed all federal taxes, including that tax on whiskey that had started the Whiskey Rebellion. And Jefferson believed that the entire government should be very small. So it consisted literally of only a few hundred people. Some included part-time workers. What did the government do? They delivered the mail. Well, that's a part-time position. They collected customs and duties, which would have been a full-time position. This is basically anybody coming into the United States and bringing something. They bought something somewhere else. They would have to pay a tax on it coming back into the United States. And then conducting a census, an official count of the population every 10 years. So you can see the government is very small. Well, Jefferson, one of his other major challenges was with the court system. And it's a somewhat complicated case, but it's based around the Judiciary Act of 1801. This act established regional courts with 16 judges and many other officials. And the second president, President Adams, had made hundreds of appointments to these positions. Remember, once you're in these positions, if you're appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, you keep your job for life. So Adams wanted to make certain that Federalists controlled the court system. He immediately asked John Marshall to serve as the Chief Justice. Now, he filled all of these blanks, these openings, so that Jefferson could not put in Republican judges. It was a brilliant move. Except we had something called the Midnight Judges. Now, President Adams, who was still president at the time, and Chief Justice John Marshall began processing the papers for all of these appointments. And you could not become a judge until the papers were delivered. And they're called Midnight Judges because literally Adams and Marshall are up until midnight. 12:01, Jefferson becomes president. 11:59, Adams and Chief Justice Marshall are still signing papers. So when Jefferson became president, a few of these commissions had not been delivered. So he tells new President Jefferson tells Secretary of State James Madison not to send them. Well, one of those commissions was for a guy by the name of William Marbury. Now, Marbury was to be given the position of a Justice of the Peace, I believe in Washington, D.C. He had been promised this position by what was then President Adams. It was very typical of if you supported the president, you would get a position. So Marbury is very upset that he does not get his position. So to force this, basically to support Madison in giving him this Justice of the Peace job, Marbury challenges his case directly to the Supreme Court. Keep in mind who's the Chief Justice, John Marshall, which political party he is. He's a Federalist. So ex-president Adams thinks he's got this one in the bag. So does Marbury. Marbury uses the Judiciary Act of 1789 as his justification for saying he can challenge directly to the Supreme Court. Well, fascinatingly enough, Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall, wrote an opinion that basically said we're not even listening to Marbury's case. The Constitution does not guarantee this case to be heard. And in fact, the Judiciary Act of 1789 is an unconstitutional law. It has to be thrown out. Basically, what Marshall does is he exercises the right of the Supreme Court to review and rule on acts of the other branches of government. That is a vocabulary term, a key term, judicial review. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to review and rule on acts of the other branches of government. Marshall simply said, if the Constitution does not provide for judicial review, how is it ever proved that laws are broken? How is it ever proved that the President of the United States overstepped his boundaries as written in the Constitution? You have to have the court system to examine that. It was simply shocking for both Marbury and President Adams that Marshall would rule in this way. Overall, John Marshall served as Supreme Court Chief Justice for about 34 years. And throughout that, even though he made the decision in Marbury versus Madison, which is a key term, I believe, and it establishes the principle of judicial review, he routinely supported strong national government and making the judicial branch equal to the legislative and executive branches. Chief Justice Marshall, I think Marbury versus Madison is the most important case in Supreme Court history because it gives the court system that power to balance, to check the powers of the other two branches of government. So we will continue on with some more of Jefferson's accomplishments here at the next slideshow.